Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this RISE webinar on why alignment for foundational skills matter. Please welcome our chair, UAE Wa.
Hello everyone, my name is Yue Hua and I'm a research fellow at the RISE Directorate, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our webinar today titled Why Alignment for Foundational Skills Matters, Cognitive Science Insights and Real-World Implications. Now, to give you some background on why we're so excited about this webinar, I have a couple of slides to show you. Can we have the slides, please? Almost there. So there we go. So now, as part of our ongoing work about the learning crisis and its implications, we at the RISE Directorate have been doing some research in which we try to synthesize why it is that foundational skills are so important for children and for education systems. And we summarize this with the term universal, early, conceptual and procedural mastery of foundational skills, or UECP-MFS, which we know isn't exactly the most catchy acronym, but we really believe that each of those words conveys a crucial part of what foundational skills are and why they are so important. And also as part of our work about education systems in developing countries, another research synthesis that we just published last week is about aligning levels of instruction with goals and the needs of students, or ALIGNS, which is a better acronym. And in ALIGNS, we look at a range of instructional programs that have successfully raised children's learning levels in developing countries. So ranging from curricular streamlining in Tanzania, to the Tusome literacy program in Kenya, to teaching at the right level, which started in India. And even though these programs differ in many ways, we identify 4 principles that are common across these approaches. One being that, as you can see in the purple box, that they all align instruction with children's learning levels. And as we were working on UECP-MFS and on ALIGNS, we were looking at research across a wide range of disciplines and levels of analysis. And one body of knowledge that we were keen to draw on is cognitive science. So for example, in this table, what we're trying to do is apply some cognitive psychology research about working memory and long-term memory to the question of what it means for an instructional task to be too hard or too easy or just right. And it turns out that just right means not only being aligned with kids' current learning levels, but also for the learning progress that you want them to aim towards. But none of us at the RISE Directorate are cognitive psychologists, which is why I was so glad when Helen Abadzi agreed to speak with us today. Now, Helen is a cognitive psychologist with just an absolute wealth of experience in studying developing countries. She's had a 27-year stint at the World Bank, and more recently, she's had positions at the Global Partnership for Education and the University of Texas at Arlington. And this slide just gives a little example of why her work is so relevant to today's topic. This was a report by Helen that was published just earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. And in this report, she lays out the evidence for why it is that complex cognitive skills are always built on a foundation of extensively practicing more basic skills and knowledge. And we'll be hearing from Helen later in the fireside chat. And in addition to Helen, we also have with us today 3 other fabulous speakers. Can we have the slides down, please? And so besides Helen, we also have Zingai Mutumbuka, who he'll be hosting the fireside chat. And Zingai, by the time he was 35, he had not only earned a PhD in chemistry, but also been named Zimbabwe's first ever Minister of Education and Culture. And today, among his many other roles, Zingai is a member of the RISE Delivery Board, and we're honored that he's joining us today on the webinar. And besides the fireside chat, before it, we'll also have 2 researchers who will share with us exciting new empirical research that really gives a vivid picture of why alignment for foundational skills matters so much. And to do that, we have Julius Atuhura from Twaweza, East Africa and the International Christian University of Japan. And we also have Dan Rodriguez Segura from the University of Virginia, who is part of the RISE Tanzania country research team. And so after the research presentations and after the fireside chat, the last part of the webinar will be a Q&A session. And you can submit your questions at any point during the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll compile those questions to be addressed during the last 30 minutes or so of this 90-minute webinar. And I can see that we have 98 people in this webinar. So I'm looking forward to a wide range of questions. And to start off, I'll just pass the time to Julius, who's going to be presenting on a recent study about alignment of curriculum, exams, and instruction in Uganda and Tanzania. So Julius, over to you.
Thank you, UAE. So in this joint work with Michelle, we quantify the alignment of academic content that is embedded in these three instructional components for primary level English and mathematics in Tanzania and Uganda. So to fix the idea of alignment, I will illustrate using this triangle of relationships. So each side of this triangle represents the extent or the degree to which content in the two respective instructional components overlaps or is aligned. So in this paper, we define the curriculum as the prescribed content to be taught and learned, and which forms the basis for assessment. Previous studies, most of them from the United States, have established a positive association between alignment measures and student achievement. So Pritchett and Beatty's of ambitious curricular hypothesis suggests that the observed low achievement profiles in developing countries might be the result of curricular content that is too advanced or that progresses too fast for the learners to keep up. So this kind of hypothesis, curricular alignment studies can build on this hypothesis. And thinking about the high stakes examination, national exams that are prevalent in many countries, Andrew Porter advises that it's important to improve the alignment between assessments and standards so as to provide a coherent set of expectations to teachers and help them do their work better. So since 2015, Twaweza East Africa and the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research and now the Center for Curriculum Analysis have been conducting basic education curricular effectiveness studies in the East African region using the surveys of enacted curriculum methodology. So this methodology refers to content analysis tools that are used to collect, process, and report curriculum data. There are two critical inputs. One is a comprehensive taxonomy that lists relevant subject topics and subtopics. Two is a 5-level description of expectations for students' learning. And when you put this together, you come up with a data set at teacher level or expert or analyst level, which data set goes through a 4-step process to yield descriptive outputs. First, we have 3-dimensional descriptive content maps. And then we have more user-friendly 2-dimensional marginal charts. And then alignment tables that report the 0 to 1 alignment indices. So 0 means no alignment at all between the instructional components you're comparing, and 1 means perfect alignment. So in practice, we take a threshold alignment measure of 0.5. So I will illustrate with the first example here, primary English in Uganda. And this is at course grain level, which means topic level. We can do this analysis at topic and subtopic level. So the 3 content maps we see here, these are highly informative 3D visual displays of content. On the left-hand side, we have the aggregated content, excuse me, in the syllabus standards for primary 1 up to primary 7. In the middle, we have the aggregated instructional content that was delivered by primary 3 and primary 5 teachers. And on the extreme right, we have the aggregated national exams content for the 3 years, 2013, 2014, 2015. So along their vertical axis, we have the topics, and along the horizontal axis, we have the levels of cognitive demand, beginning from memorize, then perform procedures, demonstrate understanding, conjecture and analysis, and then apply to non-routine or daily life situations. So let's look at the standards, the curriculum standards. We see that, let's compare these curriculum standards to the primary living examinations. So there are 4 topics that attract the most emphasis in the standards. You see the third dimension is the change in color bands. So where it's so dark, that means where the most emphasis is. So comprehension, writing applications, language study, and speaking and presenting are most emphasized in the standards. Whereas in the primary living examinations, we have vocabulary, comprehension, and language study as the most emphasized. So we can see there are differences there in emphasis. And the levels of cognitive demand that are being emphasized, in this case, they are similar. Let's move to what the teachers are doing. We see that teachers tend to cover all topics at all cognitive levels, but mostly the emphasis is towards the lower order skills of memorize and perform procedures. So the alignment between standards and exams is 0.36, which is below the threshold. And then the alignment between the content in the classroom and the standards is 0.34, which is also below. So let's move to the second example, primary math in Tanzania, also at topic level. We see 3 topics clearly dominating the standards: number sense, operations, and measurement. And then we also have operations, measurement, and basic algebra dominating the exams. But we see that the same 3, number sense, operations, measurement, dominate the instruction. So the alignment measure between the standards and the instruction is 0.44, slightly below the threshold. And then the alignment measure between the standards and the exams is 0.44, also a little bit low. But we can see clearly that the emphasis on levels of cognitive demand changes, where the standards emphasize memorize and procedure. Teachers are covering all the levels, and then the exams are mainly on procedures and demonstrating understanding. So in the paper, these are all the alignment measures that we have at topic level. So clearly we see that only mathematics in Uganda exceeds the threshold of 0.5. This is standards versus exams, mathematics in Uganda. This is standards versus teacher instruction, mathematics in Uganda. In both countries, the alignment measures for English, this is English, 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 and English. So the alignment measures for English are significantly lower than those for mathematics. And then for Tanzania's case, where we are able to compare instruction to the exams, we can see that for English, the alignment, teacher instruction alignment to the standards is better than the examinational alignment to the standards. So our main findings here are that we see low alignment measures across the 3 instructional components, and mainly the alignment measures for English are lower. And then we see similar cross-country prescribed curricular content for both subjects, with fairly smooth content progression for mathematics, but steeper content stretches for English. And we've seen that teachers tend to cover broad stripes of content and cognitive skill levels. And also on a year-to-year comparison amongst the national exams, it's clear that they're internally well aligned. So exams are similar across years. And finally, our discussion points here. We see that there is greater variation in the prescribed and taught content for mainly English, which likely makes it harder for learners to develop the literacy skills, especially in the early grades of lower primary. We saw that the alignment between the standards and exams is quite low, and this likely places incoherent demands on teachers, possibly complicating their work if they have to target exams differently from how they target the standards. And then we saw that the alignment measures for instruction as compared with the standards is also low, which could imply that the teachers have actually departed from what the standards are demanding, because they see that the standards are possibly inadequate to the environment that they are faced in the classroom. On the other hand, probably teachers do not know how well their instruction is aligned with the standards, so they do what they continue doing. So I thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, Julius, for that fascinating and also very on-time presentation. And now that Julius has given us just a snapshot of just how misaligned curriculum and exams and instruction can be under business as usual, next we're going to have Dan to show us what can happen if countries do try to move beyond that sort of misalignment toward incrementally better alignment for foundational skills. So over to you now, Dan.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Yes, thank you all for joining. I'm very excited to be here sharing some of my research with Isaac and BP, both of us from the University of Virginia, and our work is titled Evaluating Curriculum Reforms in Developing Countries, Evidence from Tanzania. Next slide, please. Okay. So as Julius very well put it, curricula are a key input of any educational system. We know that curricula set the objectives and goals of the educational system. They tell teachers basically what they have to teach. They shape the desired trajectory of skill development among students by different subgroups. And they also set the minimum standards to move to higher levels. We also know from the literature that many countries, particularly developing countries, still use elite biased curricula shaped by the colonial past. And there's some literature in economics, but also in history and sociology that documents this. And these curricula tend to produce well-educated but small elites. That's what they're fundamentally designed to do. In practice, this leads to, as Julius also mentioned, overambitious curricula. So curricula that aim higher and move faster than the pace of learning. So if we think of curricula sort of like the speed of a curricula, sort of like the speed of a car, the content is how much, the distance of the road, and the time is the time that they devote to each subject. So in this case, they're trying to cover too much distance over too little time. And this, of course, has cumulative consequences. When someone falls behind, it's really hard to get that kid to catch up, especially because these curricula usually do not build in incentives to support struggling students. And this leads to teachers focusing on just covering the curriculum as opposed to really focusing on building the core skills. So there are some hypotheses out there that simplifying the curriculum could actually improve learning for all students, especially those not at the top of the distribution. There's a very nice quote in Poor Economics: if the curriculum were radically simplified, then the vast majority of students would get something from the years they spent in school. In spite of all these hypotheses, there's still limited evidence of the impact of curriculum simplification per se. We know that there are very promising results from interventions that sort of like align better instruction to children's levels, such as teaching at the right level. But there are all other concerns, mostly around implementation and whether oversimplification could actually reduce learning. Oops, okay, sorry. Yeah, okay, so our study takes place in Tanzania. Like many other developing countries, Tanzania has enrolled school enrollment dramatically over the past decades, but this has not translated into learning outcomes. And this big push in enrollment has also led to a more diverse student body with first or second generation primary school students. So if we think about misalignment existing there before this happened, the misalignment also got bigger with this push in enrollment. And before 2015, the curriculum in grades 1 to 2 was overloaded with subjects. So, and that's in the words of the Tanzanian Ministry of Education. So as you can see, they had to cover Kiswahili, math, English, vocational skills, ICT, personality, right? So it's a lot of subjects to cover in very little time. So what ended up happening is teachers sort of focus more on, you know, just trying to get through the curriculum than actually building these skills. Oops. Okay, so the curricular simplification of 2015 was passed as part of a suite of new reforms. Basically, it focused on the 3 R's, so read, write, and arithmetic. It made more sense in Kiswahili. And the curriculum devoted 80%, at least on paper, of the instructional time to foundational literacy and numeracy. It's not that they stopped covering other subjects like science or social studies, but sort of these readings were built into their literacy instruction. The curriculum reform also kept a few other additional subjects, but it was only limited to 20% of the time. And there was no more teaching English or in English for these first 2 grades. As expected, the implementation varied across the country. So we see that, you know, training started off a little slow, teacher training, that is. 4 in 10 teachers did not receive the materials they needed to implement this reform. In practice, we estimate, our best guess sort of, is that the time spent on Kiswahili and math increased about 40%. So that is huge, but it still did not reach the 80% that we, you know, the curriculum mandated. And schools still spend some time teaching English. So the time decreased, but, you know, as other people like Ben Piper have found, there's some resistance to getting rid of English altogether. So coming back to my analogy of the car, what this reform did was not to reduce the length that, you know, the car has to cover or the material, but it just increased how much time was allocated to the foundational skills. So in practice, we basically use a quasi-experimental approach, difference in differences, which uses a nationally representative school and student level panel from 2013 to 2016. And basically we find that the reform increased student learning across the board. So we see large, significant positive effects in math and Kiswahili, which were the focus of the reform. Depending on how we look at it, we see very small to no effects in English, but definitely not enough to upset the gains in math and Kiswahili. We don't see any negative effects among high performers, which was that was one of the main concerns that we had about this reform. We find some preliminary evidence of that there was even a small decrease in dropout rates because of this reform. And of course, we conduct several robustness checks just to make sure that this holds up no matter how we look at it. And of course, these results are consistent with teaching at the right level and slowing the pace and all these hypotheses. So in terms of research, our work is sort of more evidence that supports this theory on the need to slow down the curriculum. We also believe, so if somebody knows, they can correct it, but we also believe that this is the first evaluation of a large-scale curricular simplification in a developing country. And I also have to caveat that this is still preliminary evidence and we're still, you know, exploring additional analyses and approaches. But I also wanted to say something about in terms of policy. So in terms of policy, this is preliminary evidence that suggests that there were large gains in basic numeracy and literacy from simplifying and sort of devoting more time to a curriculum. We don't see that any subgroup benefited particularly more than others. And we also don't see any negative effects for any subgroup or non-targeted subjects like English. We also find that implementation mattered. So we find that teacher training at a given school is correlated with gains nearly twice as large. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that the fiscal cost of this type of curriculum reform is relatively low, especially compared to interventions that achieve gains in the same magnitude that we do. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Wow, so now from Julius, we've had a picture of how misaligned instruction can be in some education systems. And from Dan, we've seen a way forward of how prioritizing alignment for foundational skills can hopefully lead to improvements in student learning. So now we're going to move to the main event, which I'm very excited about. And in this fireside chat, we're going to hear from Helen on just really a tiny snapshot of what she has found about alignment for foundational skills based on her decades of experience as a cognitive scientist studying education in developing countries. And the chat will be hosted by Zingai, who himself has decades of experience as a policymaker, an activist, and a leader. And as a quick reminder to everyone, please feel free to keep sending in questions at any time you like. If possible, we'd appreciate it if you use the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature, just because it's easier for us to keep track of the questions if they're in one place. And we will address the questions after the fireside chat. Zingai, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louis. I must say that I am very excited about this subject. This is something that has preoccupied me for a very long time. So I'm very happy to see that there is progress being made on this, and I hope this is just the beginning. And I hope we'll have much more discussions around these issues. But I want to ask Helen, how did you actually get started on this work on cognitive psychology, particularly as it affects learning in developing countries?
Thank you very much, Zingai. I got all my degrees in psychology, though I also have a doctorate in education administration, a master's in ed psych. I was young. When I was hired in the World Bank, I found all of these problems that we see today essentially dealt with in 1987 onwards. And the question is what solutions existed? And I had received my doctorate earlier with obligatory courses in cognitive psychology, which at least at that time, but maybe even to this day, it seems kind of boring, arcane, but I had to take it. And it ended up being the most important subject I ever studied because I could see the possibilities of nailing down and getting more specific about what to do with the learning of the poor. At the World Bank, I spent 27 years, and by the way, Global Partnership is hosted at the bank, so staff live there. And of which 15 years were spent in the evaluation department. And I went all over the world looking at these failed performance situations in classrooms and trying to figure out what to do. At the same time, the research, the neurocognitive research arose. Besides cognitive psychology, which looks at memory events from the outside, neuroscience arose that actually uses neuroimaging and say, what do various parts of the brain do when people behave in certain ways? I started monitoring that on a daily basis, starting about 1996 when the internet became active. And it's been about 27 years that I do this on a daily basis, now that I'm retired, much more than that. And one sees solutions when you put these many isolated studies together. And the solutions deserve to be put in place, which is why RISE can, and of course the World Bank and the other donors ought to learn a lot more from these syntheses. I have written over the years a number of both books and articles, and I keep doing that. What really struck me was the difference in the types of memory and how they get consolidated and what the implications are for the types of problems that Daniel and Julius have been talking about. Should I start the slides now, or do you want further discussion, Guy?
Perhaps I should ask you another question before you think about putting up the slides. From your experience, tell us in very simplistic terms, perhaps you want to show the slide then, how do humans learn and how do children develop foundational skills and knowledge?
Yes, I think it is easier if I start showing, so please, when you start showing the slides, it's a little bit easier if I do that. The big issue is that most of our memory is most of what we need for the basic skills resides in unconscious memory of tasks that are automatized without our awareness as a result of practice. And when we don't do enough practice, you get the effects of misalignment and difficulties that have been shown in many places. The children of the well-to-do get many extra hours of practice at home from reading with parents in various languages, beautiful books at the time, from the age they're like 2 or 3, to, of course, solving problems, discussing things in multiple languages. The children of the poor do not get that. Therefore, they do not get these long automatized chains that are needed. And thank you. Let's see if we can use this. Let's start the mouse. Permit me very quickly to go through memory. In a way, it's the biggest bottle of the world. There is no end to it, there's no bottom to it, and it is inhabited by networks of neurons that actually encode our memories in complex ways. In order to enter working memory, at least on the conscious effects, you have this very, very narrow neck. So this bottle has this very narrow neck. That's called working memory. So it can hold something like 4 to 7 items for about 12 seconds, extremely narrow. This is what defines the difficulty in language comprehension that the Ugandan study, for example, has shown, but also a lot of other things. We need to hold material working long enough and enough material to make sense of it. If too little flows there, or if it takes too long delays, the working memory gets wiped out. We're left with a conclusion, and we cannot proceed, which is why children can stay in a class and not understand a thing. So working long-term memory, at the same time, the part of the big bottle has 2 tracks in a way. Yes, they work together, but they need different treatment. The explicit memory basically has events of unfolding, chalk and talk. It's knowing that something is. For instance, science and social studies are a lot about this explicit memory. What is the capital of our country? How many, what kinds of people live here? How does the sun rise, etc. It's explicit memory. And children gradually acquire that. Children are very good in implicit memory, which is this largely unconscious, knowing how. Imagine, for example, trying to describe to somebody how you button your shirt. All of you will realize it's not that easy, strangely. We cannot easily talk about these parts of implicit memory. That's where procedures sit. How to read, how to dance. A song begins, and you know the song, and you can't help but produce the next line. You cannot even stop yourself from doing it. The conditioning, you're driving and a traffic light changes and you're conditioned to say, oh, I need to stop if I'm a good enough citizen. The same, habituation. I hear a train passing and after I hear it enough times, I know it's a train, it's not a bomb. The big deal about these is that they are unconscious. Therefore, when curriculum developers talk about standards, they think about conscious material. They cannot so easily, and we all cannot so easily relate to what is unconscious. How do I hold my hands when I type on the keyboard? What is the sequence, the power-up sequence of your smartphone? How do I do it? How do I enter into my email? By now, we can't easily describe it. We've got to actually go through it, and then you decide what it is. Therefore, we have this huge cognitive bias in favor of conscious information, the explicit memory, that has different consolidation rules. And strangely, with children, that is, and young children, like grades 1 and 2, it's less important. Also because at that time it is developing. You can't rely too much on explicit memory. So one strange implication is that grade 1, in order to teach everybody and give everybody enough time to practice the implicit memory chains, maybe science, social science and vocational stuff and science and computer things, well, computer maybe not, could wait. They may not. Interestingly, I think Daniel mentioned that they didn't seem to find any difference, and I can see why. Again, explicit memory is really a lesser part of our memory. Really, the larger part is implicit memory. It's kind of like it's like the tip of an iceberg. Implicit memory loves patterns. Babe bibowu, kakiki koku. 2 times 1 equals this, 2 times 2, 2 times 3, 2 times 4 in math. And these patterns are taken up for very good reasons, very well, and they're memorable. At the same time, unfortunately, people who do not understand the importance of teaching these patterns and why, say, oh, this stuff is childish. No, the children should not memorize. Unfortunately, memorization is a very essential part of our memory, and we need to build on it and make it automatic and make retrieval automatic from the implicit long-term memory, even the explicit one, to working memory in order to think critically. This is what matters. What they practice, as I've said, is essential in order to get small units of something like 1 times 1 equals 2 to link together and become inseparable in our memory, to where mention of 1 primes our system to say the rest. There are rules about that. The more you practice, the faster you retrieve these. And the reaction time, therefore, becomes, goes down. It goes faster and faster. At the same time, we stop the initially explicit effort and deliberate practice, sends these automatized units into implicit memory. So after you turn on your smartphone or your computer, if you have a new computer, enough times, then you start doing it fast and without realizing that you're doing it. And that's when you can then talk to somebody and type at the same time. It is a very much and completely a matter of practice for implicit memory. Explicit memory, you hear one item once and you may remember it or you may practice it, but this conscious retrieval, what is the capital of Burkina Faso, for example, or who won the last elections in country X? This interplay of memory functions has strong implications. We really are prisoners of our working memory. That's short neck, that short and narrow neck of the big bottle, which is actually where instruction flows into and where curricula flow into. So which information will rush into our minds first? These things determine how fast will it be retrieved. It's very much an issue of speed because working memory keeps wiping out and leaving us with one little conclusion. Therefore, strangely, speed matters above all in these early skills. And not just in these early skills, as we rise in levels of education, retrieval of big chunks, retrieval of equations, solving, integrals, that continues to matter. So as we rise in education, implicit memory is necessary in order to do anything. And then we need more practice to bring new items into implicit memory. Imagine, for example, learning how to use Excel sheets. You do that for a while and you're highly educated, and after a while you can do these formulas and not think about it. So the working memory and the implicit memory create this fluency paradox, both for reading but also for math. For reading, if you don't read fast enough, by the end of the sentence you forget the beginning. So the students need a minimum reading speed, like at least 45 to 60 words per minute, however that is defined. And if someone gets, because for a number of years, people were saying, oh, you know, what is a word? There are explanations for that, but you can skip the whole thing and say millivolts measuring event-related potentials from the visual word form area. You can skip the words per minute and go straight into neuroscience. For math, single-digit operations, the automaticity, fluency, and how many correct single-digit operations you can do in grades 2, 3, 4 matters a great deal. It reflects the same thing. So strangely, we need to do this before critical thinking. And the curricula do not typically leave enough time, certainly do not typically leave enough time for the average students. So weirdly, the most basic foundational skill is really processing speed, reading, math, language comprehension, by the way. The mention of English, and in Uganda, English being used to teach the rest. Well, if you don't know enough words, and if it takes seconds rather than milliseconds to retrieve each one of these and combine them into something that will be held into working memory, you can't make sense of the science and the social studies and history and anything else, let alone math. So strangely, we need to do this. One way, by the way, to teach English is orally, or French, where we have diglossia, or where we have in the English, Arabic, medium language of instruction, while the children are learning to compile these small units of letters, they could be learning in another hour the units of the language orally, which is why, again, in grades 1 or 2, these, for the average students, these skills should take prevalence. And because they, of course, load, again, content into implicit memory. Explicit memory is science and social studies, and it can wait, again, because children are not as good with explicit memory unless they're children of the poor. So,
Helen, sorry to interject, but could I?
Thank you.
Sorry, time is moving on, so could we just maybe bring the slides down and you and Zingai can discuss that a bit in application, so people have a bit of can process also a bit some of the fascinating things you've been teaching us.
It's complicated, by the way, and we didn't make it up somehow. That's the way the brain is set.
Indeed. Oh, Zingai, you're on mute.
Okay. This is fascinating, of course, and we could go on all day, but tell me, how should these principles be applied in resource-constrained low-income and middle-income countries, where oftentimes the teachers themselves have very little education, let alone any understanding of these principles?
Thank you. The point is not for the teachers to learn. I mean, it's nice to learn all of this, but implicit memory involves executions. Strangely, by focusing on creating automaticity, the explanation and the cognitive load on the teachers, in this respect at least, is taken out. Very quickly after my retirement, we put into place with various partners reading programs in UAE, in South India, in Malawi, in various other places where we have helped, to where we get the teachers to monitor students reading in big and spaced letters. So it is possible. The same thing with math, though I'd like to see greater math study on how to create better math for the low-income students and practice. Language, I developed a whole curriculum in Arabic for grade 1 in standard Arabic. And one gets to see how these things can be applied. Strangely, it's much easier and simpler. We do need textbooks. If you would like me, or whenever you would like me, I'll show the brief PowerPoint file on the variables that have to do with perceptual learning and how to then put reading and to some extent math into implicit memory most efficiently.
Okay, moving on, reflecting on the presentation that Julius made, in your experience, how common is it for the national curriculum, the assessment systems, and the classroom instruction to what the children actually need and to what happens in the classroom?
Again, I spent 15 years in the evaluation department of the World Bank, where I almost became an inspector of schools, worldwide inspector of schools. And I've seen many classrooms, taken many videos. Incidentally, I know 19 languages, and I learned kind of these in order to do this work in Bangla, in Arabic, etc., Malagash. There is the big problem that explicit memory biases is what we remember. Implicit memory is invisible. So the curricula typically leave too little time to practice. Also, the children of the well-to-do, the curriculum developers themselves have children, and they're not poor people, they're middle class. And in many respects, they base the curricula on what their own children can do, which is very reasonable. And that is a distinct cognitive bias. But the result is that we have the rural populations unable to create the automaticity in these low-level skills, unable to get sufficient reading practice with sufficient materials in order to catch up more or less with the well-to-do. This is a very essential difficulty. And frankly, I'm not sure how to overcome this bias with the civil servants or with the curriculum developers of any sort. Also, permit me to say, there are status implications for curricula. It is simple in theory to simplify the curricula, but then the children of the well-to-do need to enter, distinguished high schools, distinguished universities overseas, and the well-to-do can do more. So there is resistance. And of course, people do not want, and it has not been popular to have a rural curriculum and an urban curriculum, which is what Bolivia used to do like 30 years ago. You can have a curriculum for the rich and the poor, and very often it's been like the rich will do English or French and the poor will do national languages. That has not been liked at all, as we all know. So status, as well as a bias towards explicit memory, make it very hard for the children to find the time to catch up. What I would like to see, given the relative ease of automaticity when you practice, is something like the full-time schools of Brazil, Uruguay, to where the children will take more time to automatize skills. And again, use the time like that. Thank you.
Let's move to Daniel's presentation. How would streamlining the curriculum to focus on foundational skills benefit children at the beginning or at the base of their education? This is something that I'm actually familiar with and practiced even before I knew about cognitive psychology when I was Minister of Education. So I would be interested to hear what you have to say on this.
For the children of the average, the rural poor, the below average, we ought to grade 1 and maybe grade 2, but I think in most cases grade 1 only, ought to be about automatizing reading using big and spaced letters, which I can discuss, automatizing math, and actually improving the multiple dimensions of numeracy in the brain. And the teachers can do these things. The tasks are not that easy, they are not that difficult. Reading is fairly straightforward. Math, unfortunately, many teachers are not good at themselves, and a number of activities can get complicated. And also teaching language bit by bit by bit. Approaches such as direct instruction, which in the United States have been done over the years, to where the children actually listen and repeat and create more and more complicated sentences. Now listen, repeat after me one thing, repeat after me a second thing. This is what needs to be done in order to link small units into larger units and create the automaticity necessary then for holding into working memory all of these pieces and making sense of that. Grade 1 should have, in most countries, in many countries, particularly countries that have multiple languages, reading, math, language, and language orally while the children learn to read. Maybe computer science, which is involves a lot of procedural implicit memory. The science and all of this other stuff can wait until later. This is my view. And the curricula can be written like this. And what is encouraging from Daniel's study is that you don't lose all of these items that load on explicit memory. Thank you.
Zingai, could I prompt you to go to policy questions, please?
Exactly where I was going. And I was going to say that it has been very important to frame the discussion in terms of the theory and the application to the classroom. Now we have to move on to what does it mean for a policymaker. So I want you to be brief because I have 3 specific questions that I would like to ask you before we turn to the audience so that they can also ask their questions from the panelists. Some of them, the first question is, you see, some of the most common misconceptions about foundational learning is that policymakers often don't see this as something important to education systems. What would you say about
Unfortunately, yes, unfortunately, everyone is faced with a bias towards explicit memory and also interest for the better off, a sense of that, what the better off can do. And very often we deal with policymakers of that. The policymakers that we see and that I interacted with over the years were neither cognitive psychologists, not even, sometimes they were educators. They were very often lawyers, engineers, and something else. And I remember discussions in Nepal saying, my son would like to do computer science. Now, what you're talking about is not relevant to him or to us. You can get such beliefs, and they're very prevalent. If I could do it when I was a child, I was poor and I was in a rural school and I was the best. If I could do it, anybody can. This sense of what is normal, again, is a clear cognitive bias that's been studied fairly extensively. So it's been a problem. But the other problem is the donors do not speak with one voice. The donor agencies are not knowledgeable about the implications of memory and how to speed up these low-level skills. The one thing, they don't see the low-level skills. They talk about creativity and critical thinking. All of this stuff is very wonderful. Of course, children having a joyful time, which matters, then they'll get to stay on. But creativity and critical thinking are apex skills after you have automatized a whole lot of stuff. So to teach low level, just to teach 21st century complex skills, whatever that means, we've got to automatize these long streams of complex bits and bring them through milliseconds into working memory. So the implication is to please fix grade 1. Get the students literate and numerate in grade 1. Most scripts and languages, except for Chinese and 2 or 3 other situations, including Japanese kanas, can be done. And if we give the time and we automatize it, this is the biggest policy intervention. Again, there are other issues, if there is time to discuss, perceptual learning aspects that speed up the automaticity. That's 2. The other thing is the policy for policymakers is to leave the time and ensure automaticity in grade 1 for the donors, the donor agencies need to learn a lot more about this. They love data. And we see a whole lot of studies on a lot of diagnostics. But the truth is that these, the people who wrote them have not been to rural classes. One thing that the World Bank used to do, and not specifically for teaching, is put people like 30 years ago to spend a week in a village. It is quite feasible to spend 2 weeks teaching in a country and in a peri-urban or rural area whose language one knows, and then one gets to see a new sense of norm. Without it, we as donor agencies cannot give sufficiently precise advice, in my view. The other problem is the cognitive psychologists who know all this are few, and they don't work in developing countries. And the various educators do not teach these things, so there's this mismatch. The people who push the agenda love data, don't know this, that they have a different background. Those who have the kind of background that would attain, that will lead to conclusions regarding policies are not in the discussion, and there are very few also. Thank you.
Zinga, you're on mute. Sorry.
We're running short of time, and I was going to ask 2 other questions, but I'll try to combine them because you have really talked a little bit about this challenge of the trade-off between foundational skills and the learning to essential skills. And many people talk about that, and perhaps in your answer to the last question, you could address that. So if you sat down with an education minister, from where you sit and with all your knowledge and experience, what are the 3 top things that you would advise the minister to implement? These people don't want to be told too many stories. What are the 3 things you say, minister, from a policy point of view, if you did A, B, C, you could actually see changes in terms of learning outcomes from your system?
Strengthen, again, leave the time for automaticity in grade 1 and eliminate the subjects that need explicit memory, that reload on that. They will happen later. That means then using textbooks which need creation that focus on perceptual learning for reading, big spaced letters taught 1 by 1. We could show some, I think we're running out of time though. And train the teachers, strangely, in simpler procedures. A teacher needs to actually put the students to practice and then go around monitoring. We've done this, by the way, extensively. It is useful to have 2 or 3 other either parent volunteers or student teachers because the children will get distracted. There is a process of training executive functions in children to sit and to persevere. Interestingly, we did an experiment in the Seychelles with the UNESCO Bureau of International Education 1 or 2 years ago. The ministers have heard, however, too many disparate measures. The last time I tried to say this to someone, to a director of curriculum, the answer was like, why should I believe you? They tell me something completely different. And this is very important. I no longer have a voice. All of these years I've been trying to say these things, and then someone else comes with more money and with more influence, and they kind of, speak louder than what a cognitive scientist would say. So this is an essential issue. Please wait. 21st century skills are only built on low level automatic skills. Tragic mistakes, by the way, have been made in certain countries to where they say, skip the curriculum, take everything out of secondary school, and let's build communication, cooperation, and God knows what else is being called. For heaven's sake, in order to think, we need this automatized piece then of explicit memory, like what is what, what something is named, what something is defined, in order to mix it in with the implicit memory skills, executions that are coming into our working memory. You cannot do one without the other. So the point is, can we layer the curricula? Implicit memory, automaticity skills, facts, more automaticity skills at an advanced level, facts, and so on. Right now, everything is either facts or a derivation of facts that you look up on Google, presumably. And of course, most humans don't have access because they don't even process fast enough to have access. Again, we have to train everything for our working memory limitations. But when you do these things and you automatize large change, then you can have access. So my advice, please strengthen grade 1 to where nearly all students will come out reading like 30 words per minute and be able to do 20 single-digit operations in math and be able to comprehend, because there are ways to do this, language within certain speed parameters. Then you teach facts, and then you make them automatic and fluent in the more advanced items of both math and, of course, being able to read longer texts and bring vocabulary into working memory faster and faster, which again is an implicit memory. It's an effect of practice. Then you can start using derivations and inferences in order to create critical thinking. And for collaboration and all this, everyone needs to carry that knowledge with them and available within milliseconds into their heads. Because also the point is not what you know, it's what you can bring into, what you can respond to in a test, for example, within like 5 seconds. If you don't remember something within 5 seconds and you remember the next day, it's as if you didn't know it, you failed the test. So these are important pieces of advice, I think, that can facilitate the work of the ministers. If you unload the curricula early on, the students will stay on track, and then there will be less fighting about learning material in the higher grades also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are lots of questions that are being asked. I have gone through a few of them, and I'll continue to go through some of them and see how many of these we can get responses to. The first one is, I won't say it's from Pedro, but I don't think I should say where it is coming from. The real issue that is being raised here is the emphasis on foundational skills. Is it only the early grades, or is it throughout the system? I think that's the question that's being raised here. And Julius, can answer this question.
Yeah, I think the question was in the context of Tanzania. So for that, for our study, foundational skills just refers to the basic word recognition, letter recognition, short sentence reading for the literacy part, and for math, it is basically counting, inequalities, addition, that sort of core operations. And it is important to say that all kids basically took the same set of the same test or a similar version of a test across these 3 early grades.
May I answer also, Guy?
Another question raised also on Julius is you are talking a lot about cognitive demand and making no reference to the non-cognitive dimension.
This is a mistake, permit me to say, of people who do not understand how memory functions. And it's gone on for 20 years, at least, that I hear cognitive and non-cognitive. It's not the real thing. Again, if the brain creates implicit memory and explicit memory and has this big blockage of, this limited space of working memory in between. So some people, the stuff that people call non-cognitive sometimes is implicit memory. Now there is emotional reactions, there is motivation. That is a whole huge area that ought to be actually the focus of a separate webinar. But very often, may I say that cognitive versus non-cognitive is merely misnomer. It doesn't work like that. Memory functions don't work like that.
So can I build on that, Zingai? So thank you, Helen. So honestly, it's important that for holistic education, children are able to develop all the skills, cognitive, affective, psychomotor, and I mean, for a holistic development of the child, that's pretty important. But in the study that we conducted, so we go and try to code and rate competencies that are defined in the syllabus standards. And so we use this 5-level cognitive description where we begin from the low order skills like memorize, and then being able to perform the mathematical procedures, and then being able to demonstrate that the learner actually understands the content that they are being subjected to, and then as they grow up until the higher order skills. But yes, I acknowledge that it's important to focus on both cognitive and non-cognitive skills.
One participant is raising the question whether this misalignment is not a product of systems that exclude practicing teachers from active participation in the development of the curricula.
So that's another good one, a very good question. And during the process of developing this study and our analysis, we had that come a lot of the time, as in the teachers are not there at the table when curricula are being reformed in many of these countries. So, and this again feeds in with what Helen was saying. So who is deciding the curriculum policy and who are they deciding it for? It's very important. So are they deciding it for the average learner, or are they deciding it for the learner that they themselves were, or their own kids? So I will not go back to that point. But I also think it's important to add that what information are they using to make these policy decisions? So the methodology that we use in this, in the paper that I presented, is a methodology that brings a new conversation on the table, in that you now have information that is relating to you what, for example, the standards prescribe as versus what actually happens in the classroom, as told by the teachers who are in the classroom. And once you see that there is a mismatch there, this is descriptive. You're able now to ask interesting questions that can guide how the policy is made. So it's important to have all the players, especially the teachers, because they understand the environment in which they operate. But it's also important to determine which information you have to design the policy or the change in curriculum. Yeah.
If I may say, the teachers, particularly in rural areas and peri-urban areas, have a good sense of norms of how fast students learn something. So in one hand, they should be at the table quite clearly, because again, the middle-class curriculum developers, have their own children as an example, which is again, a well understood cognitive bias. We all resort to that. The problem is, as I've seen in many countries, such as Mozambique, the teachers have to struggle with materials set for high-income students. So the learning grades that they experience are for impossible textbooks. If you put them again to teach big and spaced letters one by one with tons of practice, they would experience a very different rate of learning. Same thing with math. So it's a little bit difficult to say. I would like very much to see reading worldwide to be set up according to perceptual learning, psychophysics principles, and which are universally applicable and which speed up this automaticity that we're talking about. Thank you.
Zinga, you're on mute.
We also want to hear from Daniel. One of the questions being raised, and it's all to do, or I suppose, with accountability. The question raised is, how do we move away from the old curriculum and the practice to adapt new teaching approaches if the government is still focused, if the government, that is the ministry, the teachers themselves, are still focused in the old system? How do you actually effect the change?
Yeah, I think in the case of our study, we see that very much, right? Because the curriculum reform mandated no English taught, and we see that even though there was a reduction, they were still teaching English. So in a sense, we see that what is mandated to be taught is somewhat sticky, and that teachers do stick to their old teaching practices, even if they're mandated otherwise. But we also see that that their behavior changed with the curriculum reform. So one of the biggest contrasts that we find is that the curriculum reform for everyone had an effect, but teacher training was correlated with twice as large, right? So and teacher training was at least one teacher from your school, so not even all teachers. So I think that teacher training to inform them what the new curriculum will be, that was a valuable part. And then the other thing is that there have been other curriculum reforms. I'm thinking of one in my native Costa Rica that the curriculum reform was rather to make the curriculum more complex and to give teachers more layers of content. And those have not been proven as effective as the simplification or the consolidation of time into the foundational subjects or literacy and numeracy.
Okay, this question I will put it to Ellen, since she's the only person I know who speaks 19 languages. It's almost ridiculous to imagine someone can speak so many languages. So the question really revolves around the principles and the language, and I suppose language of instruction. So there are basically two questions. The first is, how important is conceptual understanding of a procedural fluency? And the second question, and I think it's related to this, is how does fluency, you have talked about 40 to 60 words per minute, change drastically with different languages? Is it a range that broadly covers the fluency of all different languages or a specific language?
What humans use as words seem to be somewhat universal. How you measure these, we've been measuring basically breaks in writings. So the Bantu languages, you have a long, 4 or 5 words at the same, 4 or 5 words basically linked together, you count them as one. No, it's not necessary. Same thing with Lao. There are multiple ways to compare words per minute across languages and scripts. I have written about it. I'm willing to discuss this in a separate section. But what really is rather universal is more or less a sense of word. Fluency means that you string these things together to express something without thinking, how am I going to string this together? And of course, I've struggled this every day. I was doing Bahasa and Albanian and just like that, which I had to create from zero. That's a whole different thing. The good thing about language is it's really best taught orally, particularly for the young students. So you can do English, but please let us do English with analogies. I go, you go, he goes. Je vais, tu vas, il va. Vou, vai, va. Adhab, tadhab, yadhab. To where the children's implicit memory will configure the pattern. While the students are learning to read, if possible in a transparent orthography of the same script. So to teach students in Kiswahili to read, even though they, by the way, if you create larger clumps, which perceptual learning is more challenging, I would like to see the Kiswahili words cut up to where at least momentarily they can actually be separated until they get together again. Again, it was probably missionaries of the 18th century that wrote Swahili as it is, or all of these Bantu languages. So that is the artifact, is how much space you have between words. And we can do a very good job of teaching any language systematically using analogies. Again, an example is that I developed an Arabic curriculum, standard Arabic for grade 1. And for standard Arabic, at some moment I ran out of stuff to teach. It's ridiculous, but standard Arabic, because it is so systematic and you get the patterns derived and the children get these complex patterns, the famous complexity of Arabic gets reduced to a set of complex rules of yes, if, then, that have their analogies. You can do the same thing with English, with French, with anything else. When the children become fluent readers in a transparent orthography, again, English, French, Portuguese are not transparent. Voweled Arabic is, of course. But when the children become fluent readers in a transparent orthography, then you start teaching them the conventions of these complex orthographies of English, French, Portuguese. By then, they should know the language and should have short reaction times between units of English, French, Portuguese. Does that answer a little bit the question?
Oh dear.
Guy, we can't hear you.
Okay. I suppose I have to put in this question from my friend Keith Lewin, also from Sussex, my alma mater, for those who might not know. Keith asks the question, if assessment is not aligned with curriculum objectives, does the fault lie in the curriculum developers or the examiners? Conventional item response theory from the 1970s and 80s depends on using a table of specification to build valid, reliable assessment instruments. What happened to the processes that were in place in many examination boards in Africa to assure alignment and validity. Can they be reintroduced?
So
Who wants
thank
to
you.
take this?
Yes.
I'll take part of that, and then other panelists can build on that. So thanks, Grace. I think alignment validity, as we saw in my presentation, is critical, especially to send coherent messages to the teachers so that they don't have to target standards separately from the exams separately. So I think the biggest question to me is, what is the role of assessment? What do these exams, what's the role? What are they supposed to be doing? Are they assessing for learning? Are they assessing as learning, or are they assessing just learning? What have the learners taken in? So the point is, if the focus is on learning, then assessment should by all means be consistent with the standards, because the teacher has a syllabus standard before them. Okay, so if, as we, my thinking is that mostly these high stakes assessments are really, as time goes, the focus is not really too much on learning, but on how are we going, for example, to select the children who will progress from primary to secondary. And how are we going, for example, to sort them into first world schools versus second world schools? What about who gets a certificate? So these roles of assessment, increasingly, they're becoming too important. And to make it worse, the players, the one who is designing the exam is a different authority from the one who, I mean, I'll take the case of Uganda. Uganda has a National Curriculum Development Center. It's the same as Tanzania Institute of Education. And then the examination body is different. And these two different authorities don't seem to talk so much so that they can align their work. But again, the question to me is, what information are they using anyway to align? So this relates to the item response theory you talk about. But if we don't deliberately look at these three different instructional components and say we need to align them, then the discussion is a bit complex. So I think that's what I can say about it.
And one more thing.
Okay.
Just a quick thought is that, you know, there are two kinds of alignment here. One alignment is what you're being taught with what you're being tested on, but the other one is what you're being taught with the point where you start. Right? Those are two misalignments that could happen in the education process, and I think Julius may have looked more in his work to the first one, and Isaac and I have been looking more at the other one, at aligning what you're being taught to your initial starting point.
Okay, before I ask the next question, which is, I think, referring to Dania on the Tanzanian situation, I want to say that several participants requested that they be sent slides because they found them very interesting, but did not have the time really to digest the information. So if the management could send the slides to participants. So the next question is probably referring to Daniel. It comes from George Stefan. Regarding the Tanzanian curriculum reforms, it would be interesting to know what teachers tended to do with the extra time allocated to foundational skills. And if that mattered, or if just more time was the determining variable. Daniel? Or anybody else can answer if you want, but I think it's more relevant to Daniel.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that we definitely find that there was an increase in the time that was allocated for these subjects, but we don't find really any evidence that the content that they were supposed to be teaching change in any way. So it just seems that teachers had more time to really focus on this content. Unfortunately, we wouldn't have great observation data to say like they actually focus more time on it. But my best guess is that they just took longer to cover the same amount of content that was prescribed before. That is my best guess.
May I answer, Zigay, very briefly? The time needs materials. To give more time, at this moment, teachers, people criticize that, but they say they stand in front of the blackboard and do chalk and talk. Chalk and talk is fine for explicit memory. The foundational skills need all of these automatized change that are part of implicit memory. That requires long textbooks for reading, because big and space texts require more, like 150 pages, which was not unreal 50 years ago. Complex, much more for math, to where the teachers actually direct the students to practice. This is the item of the day, now practice it and mix it up with the rest. And by the way, that is a simpler way to do stuff in class. Again, you have to keep track of students, and the students need to be practicing individually. Automaticity is an individual event. So to give more time, yes, but you need to give more of the right materials aimed at automatizing. Permit me also to say, foundational skills are in every grade and for every subject, including, of course, university. You get admitted to the Department of Engineering. If you cannot do first, second, third degree equations and all of the complex things and derivatives and integrals and all that, if you cannot do them fluently and automatically, you drop out of engineering class in day one, by the first semester. Every single skill, every single subject we teach has the explicit memory requirements of information out of which you're going to make derivation, and the implicit information in the implicit memory requirements of having automatized all of these prerequisites so that everything comes into working memory in milliseconds, and then you have an answer. And we need to build for that. Thank you.
Can I ask the panelists to answer as briefly as possible, because I want to throw in 3 questions before we come to closure. That seemed to be
Zingay, we can only have one more question. Sorry, could you just?
Oh my God! It's one more question. That's really that's difficult for me. Okay. I'll try to ask one that maybe okay. The last. Okay, this is from Mira. And it says, how children's prior vocabulary help to correlate mathematical vocabulary. This is often raised in Francophone countries. Children may be good in verbal calculation based on their daily life experiences. How that helps in developing world problem reading. And this is the question of if you think in one language and then you have to learn in another language, what are the implications for foundational skills?
May I answer? This is a whole webinar, and I will be doing one of these for UNESCO in about 2 weeks. This is not a simple question. I'm asking the person to get in touch with me. There is such a thing as, it's called a triple code. The children need to connect them. They really, if we can, we should stay with the same code. If you're going to teach English throughout life, you need to start teaching using that code in grade 1, strangely. There are complicated ways of doing that. We had discussions in the Seychelles, again, 2 years ago, on how to do this. Because every time you change language, you have to re-automatize these sequences. But besides that, the whole point of math is that you get the sense of magnitude, and the sense of magnitude connects with language. Students need to get a number line and the sense of magnitude as automatized units early on. But that's, again, it's a whole different topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are almost at the end of this discussion, and we do apologize to the people who sent in fantastic questions that we didn't have the time to answer, but we will be compiling them and sending them to the speakers for follow-up. And to wrap up the discussion, I'd just like to ask Zingay, our wonderful host and moderator, to just say in one sentence what he wants us all to take away from this webinar.
Foundational skills are central to learning.
Thank you. Thank you for sticking to the constraints of the assignment, Zingai. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us in this webinar. Thank you to our fabulous speakers, to Julius, to Dan, to Zingai, and most especially to Helen. We so appreciate all that you've shared with us. Just to let everyone know, our next RISE webinar will look at the role of bureaucracies and bureaucrats in the successful or unsuccessful implementation of education reforms. That'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, the 1st of December. The details have just been posted into the chat. And if you'd like to be notified once the registration opens for that, you can follow us on social media or sign up for updates on the RISE website, which is riseprogram.org. And we'll be sending that link in a follow-up email to everyone, along with links to the papers mentioned, and to the presenters who agree, we'll also send their slides. So hopefully everyone will get to look at Helen's fascinating perceptual learning and textbook slides that we didn't have time to show. So till then, take care, everyone. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, and thank you.